Listen up, Libtard. Rainbow Six Siege used to look like this. Now it looks like this because of... So dudes, I'm G and I yap about Rainbow Six. So in this video, I'm going to give a brief overview of Siege and its unique gameplay, and talk about its initial tactical shooter identity, which it's trying to do right now. We're going to look at the complex evolution of the game and its struggle to define itself within the gaming landscape. I'm also going to talk about the game's kind of hesitation to label itself as a tactical shooter until relatively recently. That seems to be an actual marketing strategy. Those seem to be words that the press team is really pivoting into as their campaign practice. So to summarize, back when the game launched in 2015, it had a unique blend of tactical gameplay and destructible environments, and that's what set it apart from everything else. It was supposed to be a very distinct kind of game that was separate from an arcade-style, gunfight-heavy, Call of Duty-esque sort of game. And this is evident in the mechanics. You have to gather information. There's a benefit to planning your moves. The game is rich with strategic depth and tactical decision-making. But at the same time, it was difficult to tell, because at some points, especially when you got up to higher elo, people could leverage their mechanical aim, they could leverage their mechanical gun skill to great effect. Some mechanics that you look at now wouldn't be able to fit in the current landscape, and they would obviously just make the whole TDM argument a million times worse. You had stuff like Blitz being able to move his hitbox back and forth a million times. Bolo peeking. The game was heavily involved in terms of being able to manipulate your hitbox, and this didn't really have anything to do with the marketing that they gave out. This wasn't what the game looked like in 2015. A lot of people, I think, year one, year two, enjoyed it that way and played it that way, but let's be honest, a lot of these guys were boomers. A lot of these guys were dads who didn't know what quick peeking was or what a refrag was. They just saw a cool game, you know, a Tom Clancy game, and they were like, oh, cool, new Rainbow game came out. But the actual target audience for this was very, very small. What a lot of people don't remember when they reminisce about the golden age of Siege or whatever, is that very few people actually played the game in 2015. It went through a massive upswing in 2016 to 2019 because of a pivot to a competitive shooter aspect to make it a little bit more analogous to Counter-Strike. The cool thing about making an analogy to Counter-Strike is that if you don't like Counter-Strike, you are dog shit at FPS games, and your opinion is invalid. The cool thing about making an analogy to Counter-Strike is that Counter-Strike is perfect, and if you don't like it, you might be a dumb there has to be a different way to word this. The cool thing about making an analogy to Counter-Strike is that Counter-Strike is widely regarded as a competitively viable game that bases its esports component as an integral part of the mechanical design. But with Rainbow Six Siege, this was a harder sell to make because that wasn't necessarily the target audience that the game had. So even though there were people that really liked it, there were also people that didn't like the direction that it was going in. Ironically, a lot of the changes that were done for competitive play to make the game more competitively enjoyable were done at the expense of the bolo lean cracked FPS Call of Duty meta guy. Siege underwent numerous changes through seasonal updates, with new operators, maps, gameplay mechanics, and these updates were aimed at keeping the game fresh and engaging for the player base. But these changes led to a gradual shift in the game's identity, mainly in the art style and the thematic imagery of the game. The most difficult component to sell about this was the fact that Rainbow Six was not a dedicated single-player experience like the previous titles. It was a multiplayer game. So in order to coincide with these two things, right, in order to, I guess you could say, justify the fact that it is a competitive shooter, they tried to inject lore that was analogous to its design as a competitive shooter. And this flopped quite badly. This was received pretty badly. There were a couple of cutscenes that were received well initially, but then it was clear that this was really what they were leaning into. And then eventually the plot that they had, which was like a Marvel's Civil War kind of thing, where you had PMCs versus cooked-by-the-book operators infighting within the team. The game didn't have a dedicated bad guy. There was no dedicated antagonist. There was no global threat that Rainbow was activated to deal with. Now Rainbow was a training exercise and a sports drama, not a drama about international crime. You also added a lot of characters that weren't really in line with what you would typically think of when you see, you know, SWAT operator. Yana in particular was maligned as a significant departure from the game's art design as it existed in the past, and not a lot of people were particularly happy about that. Now, you still had some operators here and there that were a little bit more in line with that, like Goyo, but it was clear that they wanted to spread their net as far as possible. And then something happened around year 8, right after the pandemic, finally started to kind of wrap up. Ubisoft realized that they had a market opportunity here that they could use to separate Rainbow Six from the pack. And that was to combine the competitive viability of an esports-focused shooter with the elements of an old-school tactical shooter like SOCOM, to actually make the game in line with the vision that they posited back in 2015. So we started seeing a lot more tactical-looking operators. Ubisoft hired an artist by the name of Sunstark, who drafted a lot of designs for much more tactical, much more old-school Tom Clancy sort of uniforms. This also coincided with mechanical changes that pivoted towards slower gameplay and more realistic tactical elements, like one in the chamber. When you shoot and you reload early, you get one bullet in the chamber and then you have to finish the reload, so you have to commit to the reload. That is a mechanic that is in line with how firearms behave in reality. Doing this has a number of advantages. One, it makes certain mechanics a little bit more intuitive and a lot easier to teach. For people that are familiar with this kind of stuff, you don't have to spend a million hours in a tutorial section explaining, yeah, this is why the gun does this, this is why peeking does this. But at the same time, Rainbow Six Siege still is a video game at its core, and it does, have some video gamey elements. It is a video game, it is not a simulator. So since it is not a simulator, it's gonna have a number of quirks that are evident throughout the entire FPS genre, like your gun basically being a laser beam that spews out of your head in a straight line. Recoil that can be arbitrary and not necessarily something that, is assigned to that particular weapon in terms of a physics-based model. Balance decisions for parts of the game that are done not necessarily because this is how it would exist in reality, but because this is competitively healthy for the game, and if we don't address it, it will create an unfair advantage. But Rainbow Six Siege, because of its roots with a Tom Clancy product, has a really, really hard time and has had a really hard time trying to coincide with its esports heritage because the target audience just doesn't like it. There's a really weird sort of backlash that goes on in FPS gaming communities across every single game nowadays, where esports are put in the same category as corporate greed and corporate rot and live service, yada, yada, yada. Now, of course, Valve, beloved Valve, is allowed to get away with all of this. They're allowed to start live service as we know it today with Team Fortress 2. They're allowed to have a game that is completely and totally centered around its esports component. They're allowed to have microtransactions up the ass. They're allowed to have basically gambling, what's kind of in a roundabout sense, essentially gambling for kids. Now, it's not targeted towards kids, but there's certainly kids who participate in it. Valve is allowed to do all of these things because Gabe Newell is based or something. And to be clear, I also believe that Gabe Newell is based. I think Gabe is a pretty profoundly impactful guy in the industry, but it's clear that there's a double standard depending on which games, which audience, and which people you are talking to. You are going to get different answers from different people. Halo is supposed to just die, and it's supposed to get tossed into the dustbin because it has esports or something. I'm not really sure what the rationale is there. As far as I'm concerned, I would rather have the Rainbow Six property, go on and have the potential to be made into something else in the future rather than for it to just die in 2015. Because that's what would have happened to Rainbow Six. Rainbow Six did not have a good launch. It had a quite bad launch. If you look at the numbers, people were not excited about a $60 release, multiplayer only, limited amount of content, scaling back content that you would typically find in a Rainbow Six license. It managed to get a little bit of a seed grown because it existed off of a previous IP, but I think on its own as a $60 release, it significantly suffered from that. And these kinds of things matter, right? Like marketing timings, positioning your product within a certain kind of window at a certain kind of price can kill it before it happens. A great example of this was Lawbreakers. Lawbreakers, I fucking loved Lawbreakers. I played the shit out of Lawbreakers. Lawbreakers was my main game for about a month when it was around. When I played during the closed beta, I had a ton of fun experimenting with all the different characters in that game and the different nuances of the movement and the guns, and just it was a blast. It was just a really, really fun arena shooter that obviously wasn't trying to be realistic, but it had a big emphasis on 3D omnidirectional movement. And then it died because it was managed badly, not because the core concepts of it were necessarily bad ideas. Other hero shooters have managed to come out relatively recently, and they've been able to at least gather some kind of audience. Even Overwatch 2, which was maligned for a lot of its marketing problems and just the colossal shit show that was going on over at Activision Blizzard, which certainly had overlapping effects with the way the game was handled from a marketing push sort of perspective. People still play Overwatch 2. Overwatch 2 still has an active community. Is it a large community? Is it as big as people thought it was going to be? I don't know. It got a spot at DreamHack Dallas when I was at DreamHack Dallas recently. The Overwatch League, or I guess the new version of the Overwatch League. I forget exactly what it's called. Maybe that is, evidence against my argument. But still, it didn't look dead to me. There were people cosplaying. There were people there. It has a dedicated community. But people do not put those words together, right? They say it's either popping off or it's dead. There's absolutely no in between with gamers. You have to be one or the other. And it's silly, but that's the nature of the internet and algorithmic entertainment. It's about hard-hitting gotchas that'll get you updoots, not what is incongruence with reality. Funnily enough, a lot of the changes to the game, especially relatively recently, have been quite mixed. A lot of the changes that are done for the sake of making the game slower are often leveled at the Pro League, right? They say, this is for the Pro League, so that's why it's bad. When they were asking for the game to be slower and more tactical and not be like Call of Duty. I guarantee you that if the movement and the mechanics of the game now were the way it was back in 2016, the amount of argumentation that you would see about it would be 10 times as much. People are leveling arguments about the TDM meta nowadays, not because the game mechanically is slow. They're leveling arguments about the TDM meta because gadgetry in general has taken a backseat to where it used to be 4 years ago during the utility simulator of 2020. A lot of people got into the game during 2020 because of the pandemic, because everybody was stuck inside watching streams and playing video games all day. So that era of the game is often, it's still seated in the back of people's minds. But the reality is, the actual gameplay loop, the actual function of interfacing with the game, when you take gunfights and how you approach gunfights, is significantly more deliberate. It is significantly slower. You may be dying as a result of gunfights more often, but the actual pacing of the gunfight is a lot slower than it was. And even if the mechanics were the same as 2016, if you copy-pasted that version with all of these operators that we have right now, the game would be a million times faster. So Siege is put in a very frustrating position where it has to continue to evolve in order to be a live service game to attract new players. But it remains to be seen whether or not it can reconcile with its past and find a stable identity that satisfies old and new players. And I think that there are a limited amount of ways to do this, but I think that Ubisoft has taken a smart approach here by pivoting when they did. Because when they pivoted in year 8, most Siege players, at least in my estimation, felt like there was a very, very strong sort of thematic shift. I talked about this a lot. Whenever I talk about the art style of the game, whenever I talk about the lore, whenever I talk about the writing, these decisions do matter. They don't exist in a vacuum. If you ignore the artistic approach of your game, it's the first thing that people see when they look at the game. So people are going to make conclusions about it without even playing it. You have to put your best foot forward in terms of that department. You cannot just put it to the side, even if it is a multiplayer only game. You can focus on the multiplayer mechanics and you can phone it in a little bit, but you can't just completely phone it in. There has to be some kind of effort made. A good example of this right now is Concord. I'm sure that mechanically Concord is sound. I'm not super thrilled about it. I think I've played this kind of game a million times before. I think if I wanted to play a non-elimination, big team sort of, here's a bunch of abilities, characters with unique abilities, yada yada kind of game, I think I'd rather just play Overwatch. I think Overwatch 2 has pretty much, they've taken that formula and they've done the best that, to me anyway, that's the most interesting I think you can ever really make the formula. But with Conquered, I'm sure that it's competent, but it just looks so boring. Like, it's very, very clear that it's very phoned in and just kind of like haphazardly approached. It has Marvel quippy dialogue for its cutscenes that feel like it was lifted out of 2016, and it sounds like the bad dialogue from 2016. It does not sound like the, passable dialogue.
No one moves. We'll be taking this off your hands.
What? This?
How bad is it? You're still mad at me?
I am developing a taste for destruction.
So regardless of whether your game is good or not, this is your first impression that people are going to see, and it's not going to help, right? It's really not going to help with your marketing, especially as in the case of Conquered, right, they are charging $40 for this multiplayer only experience. And as far as I can tell, most people are really unhappy with this product. They're not exactly, super thrilled about it. And I think people have a right to be. I think people have a right to look at this and go, this does not look very good. I'm not sure what is, particularly intriguing about this. Comparatively to other things that are coming onto the market, we have a game called Spectre Divide, which has Shroud working on it, if you're familiar with Counter-Strike esports, and obviously, his Twitch presence. This game is a 3v3-ish sort of style game where you have a body that you can swap in between two. So technically it's kind of a 6v6-ish sort of game. But when you have a game with this kind of man count, you can approach the map design with a completely different set of rules. So there's evidence to suggest that if they really lean into the sandbox that they've created here, the actual feel, the actual sort of gameplay loop that you would get from a game like Spectre Divide, where you're setting up your own crosses and playing for your own refrags, but you're in what's kind of a 3v3 space, but it's not really a 3v3 space, that has implications for the map design. Maybe the map design is set up to facilitate the body swapping mechanic, right? You'll have a vantage point and then another cross somewhere else. It allows you to play around with it and really have fun with the design. Also, the art style, as far as I can tell, it kind of looks like Counter-Strike meets Borderlands or Counter-Strike meets Jet Set Radio Future, which is sick. I really fuck with this a lot. Comparatively, I'm pretty excited for Fragpunk. Like, it looks like a fun, Call of Duty-esque sort of like jump around and shoot kind of game. But I would not hold it against anybody if they looked at this game and they're like, I don't get the difference. What's supposed to be different about this versus Call of Duty? What's supposed to be different about the new Black Ops 6 versus all the other Call of Duties? You and I might look at the animations and go, wait, that seems a lot more fluid. It seems like they're implying that the movement is going to be, this omnidirectional kind of sprint thing that they're going for. But the average person is going to look at this and just see another Call of Duty. And then at that point, well, how many people have you lost? I think Call of Duty can get away with this because it's a massive license that is already going to have name brand recognition, and you're going to have a dedicated community that's going to give you money up front. But when it comes to generating new audience members, it's much more difficult for these games to do that anymore. So for Rainbow Six Siege, it actually has an interesting opportunity here because it is positioned as an esports-centric game. It allows it to pivot into these kinds of themes, this sort of more hardcore military-style kind of game, and really cement itself as a unique experience. I know that a lot of people aren't gonna like it just because of the fact that there is esports in it at all, but I really do think that this is just the loud minority. The silent majority, as far as I can tell, is enthusiastic about the esports scene. Every single event that I've gone to has been hugely, hugely supportive of what's going on, even in spite of things like the Rainbow Six membership, which was, obviously booed at the venue, and you could hear it, pretty much throughout the entire building. People were not walking out of the event talking about the membership. They were talking about the crazy plays that they just watched. They were talking about, that play that this guy did reminded me of what you did a couple of years ago in, whatever league that they were playing, because these kinds of tournaments tend to be popular among amateur competitive players who want to get into the scene, obviously. But what's interesting about this too is that it's not just attracting, competitive sweats, it's attracting average people. There are dads, veteran dads, right, who are into Tom Clancy as a game. Their kid might be really into it. They go to the event and they have a great time. And as far as I can tell, right, the adults in the room that exist in real life, not the hyper sweat neckbeards online, really do think that the esports focus here is pretty interesting. I remember having an Uber ride in Atlanta where I was talking to the Uber driver and they mentioned, oh yeah, I played those games, back in the 90s, like a long time ago. And I was like, oh wow, no kidding. And she was really interested to hear that the game had a esports component because her kid wants to be a professional gamer too. And she's trying to tell her kid, hey, maybe just, have some realistic expectations about this sort of thing. But that conversation I had, I think is more reflective of the average sentiment that people have these games. The lack of interest in these games doesn't really have anything to do with the fact that it is a competitive shooter. It just has to do with the fact that a lot of games that were popular in the 90s and in the early 2000s, that audience of gamers grew out of gaming. They didn't renew their World of Warcraft subscription. They didn't get a new PC. They didn't get an Xbox. Maybe they got an Xbox for their kid. They might play Madden. But it's okay. Like, audiences evolve. Audience members of a particular product move on and they do other things. So we can't keep trying to claw back the past. We can only recontextualize where the game was and try to make it into something that exists within the time frame that we're in right now. Despite the fact that Rainbow Six, has a noticeable identity crisis, it's gone through this whole sort of rigmarole of going from counterterrorism narrative to competitive, sports fantasy, back to counterterrorism, kinda, sorta, like it's a little bit more, Jack Ryan-y right now. It has made an effort to return to a more tactical, military-themed style, and I think that was a smart approach from Ubisoft. I think that style is going to be really, really helpful in terms of teaching people the game because it's going to feel a little bit more intuitive to people that are familiar with this kind of stuff. It has slower paced gameplay that's a little bit more focused on realism than it used to be. Just look at one-shot headshot. I mean, like, that mechanic in and of itself is already miles beyond what every other, arcadey focused sort of shooter is doing right now. It has aspects about it that are certainly quite different than how it was presented in 2015, but I think that Ubisoft, in recent memory, has made a good faith approach to approach the marketing of the game from a place that makes sense and something that everybody can get behind. The reactions have been mixed. A lot of people obviously will just write this game off until the end of time, until something really drastic is done about the cheating situation, which is fair. I'm not saying that people don't have a right to be upset about that. I'm upset about it too. But I think there is an appreciation for a tactical return, and it feels like within the last 2 years there's been a reclamation of the game's lost identity, and I think that has reverberating effects throughout various Tom Clancy licenses as well. If you even look at Tom Clancy's Breakpoint, or Ghost Recon Breakpoint, there were parts of that game that felt a little bit more video gamey, right? That felt a little bit more Ubisoft-ish, right? If we want to dare venture down that path. But you have guys like Operator Drewski that are doing tactical mods for this game. So if there is a flavor there, if there is a capacity to make this kind of game, and people are going to mod it into existence, I feel like that shows that there is a demand for this with modern Tom Clancy products, and that we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's challenging to maintain a consistent player base and identity in the age of algorithmic entertainment, but I think that Rainbow Six Siege seems to be going in that direction, and I'd like to make future videos talking about this, particularly from the writing standpoint, particularly from the lore standpoint, because, we get a limited amount of it, but it is interesting what they have cooked up. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. Can Siege reconcile its past with its future? Let me know. I'd be curious to see what you think. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I will see you all in the next video. Take care. Deuces.